Hey everyone, this is the third chapter from Louis Althusser's piece in his section of Reading Capital. I'm reading the chapters one at a time. This is the third chapter, and the third chapter is titled The Merits of Classical Economics. So, let us therefore take things as we are told they are, and ask how Marx himself thinks himself, not only directly when he examines in himself what distinguishes him from the classical economists, but also indirectly when he thinks himself in them, i.e. registers in them the presence or presentiment of his discovery in their non-discovery, and therefore thinks his own perspicacity in the blindness of its closest prehistory. I cannot go into every detail here, although all of the details deserve a precise and exhaustive study. I propose to concentrate on a few elements only, which will act as so many pertinent indices to the problem we are concerned with. Marx assesses his debts to his predecessors, and therefore estimates what is positive in their thought, with respect to his own discovery, in two distinct forms which emerge very clearly in theories of surplus value. On the one hand, Marx pays homage to one or other of his predecessors for having isolated and analyzed an important concept, even if the words that express this concept are still caught in the trap of linguistic confusion or ambiguity. In this way, he registers the concept of value in Petty, the concept of surplus value in Stewart, the physiocrats, etc. Marx then makes allowances for isolated conceptual gains, usually extracting them from the confusion of a still inadequate terminology. On the other hand, Marx stresses another merit which does not involve any particular detailed gain, any concept, but the, quote, scientific, end quote, mode of treatment of political economy. Two features seem to Marx to be discriminatory in this respect. The first, in a very classical spirit that might perhaps be called Galilean, concerns the scientific attitude itself, the method which brackets out sensory appearances, i.e. in the domain of political economy, all the visible phenomena and practico-empirical concepts produced by the economic world, rent, interest, profit, etc. In other words, all those economic categories from the, quote, everyday life, end quote, which at the end of Capital, Marx says is the equivalent of a, quote, religion, end quote. The effect of this bracketing is to unveil the hidden essence of the phenomena, their essential inwardness. For Marx, the science of political economy, like every other science, depends on this reduction of the phenomenon to the essence, or, as he puts it, in an explicit comparison with astronomy, of the, quote, apparent movement to the real movement, end quote. All the economists who have made a scientific discovery, even a minute one, have done so by way of this reduction. However, this partial reduction is not enough to constitute the science. At this point, the second feature intervenes. A science is a systematic theory which embraces the totality of that science's object and seizes the, quote, internal connection, end quote, which links together the, quote, reduced, end quote, essences of all economic phenomena. The great merit of the physiocrats, and of Quinet in particular, was that, even if only partially, since they restricted themselves to agricultural production, they related phenomena as diverse as wages, profit, rent, commercial gain, etc., to a single original essence, the surplus value produced in the agricultural sector. It was Smith's merit that he outlined this systematic, while liberating it from the agricultural presuppositions of the physiocrats. But at the same time, Smith was at fault in only half finishing it. Smith's unforgivable weakness was that he wanted to think of having a single origin, objects of a different nature, both true, reduced, quote, essences, end quote, and also crude phenomena not reduced to those phenomena's essences. The result is that his theory is no more than the unjustified grouping of two doctrines, the exoteric, which unites unreduced, crude phenomena, and the esoteric, which unites essences, of which only the latter is scientific. This simple comment by Marx is heavy with meaning. It implies that it is not just the form of systematicity that makes a science, but the form of systematicity of the, quote, essences, end quote, of the theoretical concepts alone, and not the systematicity of interlinked crude phenomena, elements of the real, or the mixed systematicity of, quote, essences, end quote, and crude phenomena. However, it was Ricardo's merit that he thought and went beyond this contradiction between Smith's two, quote, doctrines, end quote, and conceived political economy in the true form of scientificity, i.e. as the unified system of concepts which expresses the internal essence of its object. Quote, but at last Ricardo steps in, ... The basis, the starting point for the physiology of the bourgeois system, for the understanding of the bourgeois system's internal organic coherence and life process, is the determination of value by labor time. Ricardo starts with this and forces science to get out of the rut, to render an account of the extent to which the other categories, the relations of production and commerce, forms of this basis, evolved and described by it, correspond to or contradict this basis, this starting point, to elucidate how far a science, which in fact only reflects and reproduces the manifest forms of the process, therefore also these manifestations themselves, corresponds to the basis on which the inner coherence, the actual physiology of bourgeois society rests on the basis which forms its starting point. And in general, to examine how matters stand with the contradiction between the apparent and the real actual movement of the system. This is then Ricardo's great historical significance for science, end quote. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value, Marx Engels Collected Work 31, page 391. The reduction of the phenomenon to the essence, of the given to its concept, and the internal unity of the essence, the systematicity of the concepts unified behind their concepts. These, then, are the two positive determinations which, in Marx's eyes, constitute the condition for the scientific character of an isolated result or a general theory. But the reader will have noted that these determinations express with respect to political economy the general conditions for the existing scientific rationality, the existing capital T theoretical. Marx merely borrowed them from the existing state of the sciences, importing them into political economy as the formal norms of scientific rationality in general. When Marx judges the physiocrats Smith or Ricardo, Marx applies these formal norms to them, deciding whether they have respected or ignored them, without prejudging the content of their objects. However, we shall not restrict ourselves to purely formal judgments. Has the content that these forms abstract from not already been designated by Marx in the economists themselves? Do concepts that Marx makes the foundation of his own theory, value and surplus value, not already appear in person in the theoretical character of the classical economists, together with the phenomenon essence reduction and theoretical scientificity? But this presents us with a strange situation. It seems that in essentials, and this is how Marx's modern critics have judged his undertaking, Marx is really no more than the heir of classical economics, and a decidedly well endowed one. Marx obtained from his forebears his key concepts, the content of his object, and the method of reduction, as well as the model of internal systematicity, the scientific form of his object. What, then, is peculiar to Marx? What is Marx's historical merit? Simply the fact that Marx extended and completed an already almost complete work. Marx filled in the gaps, resolved the problems it had left open. In sum, Marx increased the patrimony of the classics, but on the basis of their principles, and therefore of their problematic, accepting not only their method and theory, but also together with the latter the definition of their object itself. The answer to the question, what is Marx's object, what is the object of capital, is already inscribed apart from a few nuances and discoveries, but in principle, in Smith and especially in Ricardo. The great theoretical web of political economy was already there waiting, a few threads already in a few holes, certainly. Marx tightened the threads, straightened the weave and added a few stitches. In other words, Marx finished the work, making the work perfect. In this account, the possibility of a misunderstanding in reading Capital disappears. Marx's object is no more than Ricardo's object. The history of political economy from Ricardo to Marx thus becomes a beautiful unbroken continuity, which is no longer a problem. If there is a misunderstanding, the misunderstanding is elsewhere, in Ricardo and in Marx, no longer between Ricardo and Marx, but between the whole of the classical economics of labor value, which Marx merely brilliantly touched up, and a modern marginalist and neo-marginalist political economy which rests on a quite different problematic. In fact, when we read certain of Gramsci's commentaries, Marx's philosophy is Ricardo generalized. Rosenthal's theoretical analyses, or even the much more critical remarks of de la Volpe and his disciples, we are struck by the fact that we never forsake this continuity of object. These authors see no essential difference between Smith and Ricardo's object and Marx's object. This non-difference of object has been registered in the vulgar Marxist interpretation in the following form. The only difference is in the method. The method which the classical economists applied to their object was merely metaphysical, but Marx's method, on the contrary, was dialectical. Everything, therefore, depends on the dialectic, which is thus conceived as a method in itself, imported from Hegel, and applied to an object in itself, already present in Ricardo. Marx simply sealed this unhappy union with the miracle of genius, and like all happiness, it has no history. Unfortunately, we know that there remains one, quote, tiny, end quote, difficulty. The history of the, quote, reconversion, end quote, of this dialectic, which has to be, quote, put back on its feet, end quote, if this dialectic is to walk on the terra firma of materialism. Here, too, I have not evoked the facilities of this schematic interpretation, which no doubt has its political and historical justification, simply for the fun of disagreeing with them. This hypothetical continuity of object from classical economics to Marx is not restricted to Marx's opponents, or even to some of Marx's supporters. This hypothetical continuity of object from classical economics to Marx emerges silently again and again in Marx's own explicit discourse, or rather, it emerges from a certain silence of Marx's which unintentionally doubles his explicit discourse. At certain moments, in certain symptomatic points, the silence emerges as such in the discourse and forces it against its will to produce real theoretical lapses, in brief blank flashes, invisible in the light of the proof, words that hang in midair, although they seem to be inserted into the necessity of the thought, judgments which close irreversibly with a false obviousness, the very space which seemed to be opening before reason. All that a simple literal reading sees in the arguments is the continuity of the text. A, quote, symptomatic, end quote, reading is necessary to make these lacunae perceptible, and to identify behind the spoken words the discourse of the silence, which emerging in the verbal discourse induces these blanks in it, blanks which are failures in its rigor, or the outer limits of its effort, its absence once these limits are reached, but in a space which it has opened. I should give two examples. Marx's conception of the abstractions that underlie the process of theoretical practice, and the kind of criticism Marx makes of the classical economists. The third section of the 1857 introduction can rightly be regarded as the discourse on method of the new philosophy founded by Marx. In fact, it is the only systematic text by Marx which contains, in the form of an analysis of the categories and methods of political economy, the means with which to establish a theory of scientific practice, i.e. a theory of the conditions of the process of knowledge, which is the object of Marx's philosophy. The theoretical problematic underlying this text allows us to distinguish Marxist philosophy from every speculative or empiricist philosophy. The decisive point of Marx's thesis concerns the principle distinguishing between the real and thought. The real is one thing, along with the real's different aspects, the real concrete, the process of the real totality, etc. thought about the real is another, along with its different aspects, the thought process, the thought totality, the thought concrete, etc. This principle of distinction implies two essential theses. 1. The materialist thesis of the primacy of the real over thought about the real, since thought about the real presupposes the existence of the real, independent of that thought. The real, quote, retains its autonomous existence outside the head just as before, end quote. Grundrisse, page 101. 2. The materialist thesis of the specificity of thought and of the thought process with respect to the real and the real process. This latter thesis is especially the object of Marx's reflections in the third section of the introduction. Thought about the real, the conception of the real, and all the operations of thought by which the real is thought and conceived belong to the order of thought, the elements of thought, which must not be confused with the order of the real, the element of the real. Quote, the totality as it appears in the head as a totality of thoughts is a product of a thinking head, end quote. Similarly, the thought concrete belongs to thought and not to the real, the process of knowledge, the work of elaboration, Verarbeitung, by which thought transforms its initial institutions and representations into knowledges, or thought concrete, takes place entirely in thought. No doubt there is a relation between thought about the real and this real, but it is a relation of knowledge, a relation of adequacy or inadequacy of knowledge, not a real relation, meaning by this a relation inscribed in that real, of which the thought is the adequate or inadequate knowledge. This knowledge relation between knowledge of the real and the real is not a relation of the real. That is known in this relationship. The distinction between a relation of knowledge and a relation of the real is a fundamental one. If we did not respect it, we should fall irreversibly into either speculative or empiricist idealism. Into speculative idealism, if with Hegel we confuse thought and the real by reducing the real to thought. Into empiricist idealism, if we reduce the thought with the real by reducing thought about the real to the real itself. In either case, this double reduction consists of a projection and realization of one element in the other, of thinking the difference between the real and thought about it as either a difference within thought itself, speculative idealism, or as a difference within the real itself, empiricist idealism. Naturally, these theses pose problems, but they are problems unambiguously implied in Marx's text. Now this is what interests us. Examining the methods of political economy, Marx distinguishes two such methods, a first one that starts from the, quote, living whole with population, nation, state, several states, etc., end quote, as a second one that starts from the, quote, simple relations, end quote, such as, quote, division of labor, money, value, etc., end quote. There are therefore two methods, one starting from the real itself, the other from abstractions. From abstractions. Which of these two methods is correct? Quote, it seems to be correct to begin with the real and the concrete, ... However, on closer examination, this proves false, end quote. The second method, which starts from simple abstractions in order to produce knowledge of the real in a, quote, thought concrete, end quote, is obviously the scientifically correct method, end quote. And this was the method of classical political economy, of Smith and Ricardo. Formally, there is no need here to look beyond the obviousness of this discourse. But in its obviousness, this discourse contains and conceals one of Marx's symptomatic silences. This silence is inaudible everywhere in the development of the discourse, which sticks to showing that the process of knowledge is a process of work, in theoretical elaboration, and that the thought concrete or knowledge of the real is the product of this theoretical practice. This silence is only, quote, heard, end quote, at one precise point, just where it goes unperceived. When Marx speaks of the initial abstraction, on which the work of transformation is performed, what are these initial abstractions? By what right does Marx accept in these initial abstractions the categories from which Smith and Ricardo started, thus suggesting that he think in continuity with their object, and that therefore there is no break in object between them and him? These two questions are really only one single question. Precisely, the question that Marx does not answer, simply because he does not pose the question. He does not pose the question. Here is the site of his silence, and this site, being empty, threatens to be occupied by the, quote, natural, end quote, discourse of ideology, in particular of empiricism. Quote, the economists of the 17th century, e.g., always begin with the living whole, with population, nation, state, several states, etc., but they always conclude by discovering through analysis a small number of determinate, abstract general relations such as division of labor, money, value, etc. As soon as these individual moments had been more or less firmly established and abstracted, there began the economic systems which ascended from the simple relations such as labor, division of labor, need, exchange, value, end quote. Marx. Silence as to the nature of this, quote, analysis, end quote, this, quote, abstraction, and this, quote, establishment, end quote. Silence, or rather the interrelationship of these, quote, abstractions, end quote, with the real form which these abstractions have been, quote, from which these abstractions have been, quote, abstracted, end quote, with the, quote, intuition and representation, end quote, of the real, which thus seems in their purity the raw material of these abstractions without the status of this material, natural or raw, having been expressed. An ideology may gather naturally in the hollow left by this silence, the ideology of a relation of real correspondence between the real and the real intuition and representation, and the presence of a, quote, abstraction, end quote, which operates on this real in order to disengage from the real these, quote, abstract general relations, end quote, i.e. an empiricist ideology of abstraction. The question can be posed in a different way, but its absence will always be noticed. How can these, quote, abstract general relations, end quote, be called, quote, determinate, end quote? Is every abstraction as such the scientific concept of its object? Surely there are ideological abstractions and scientific abstractions, quote, good and, quote, bad abstractions. Silence. Footnote. The price of this science, read chapter 7 of Rosenthal's book, Le Problème de la Dialectique dans le Capital, and in particular the pages devoted to avoiding the problem of difference between, quote, good and, quote, bad abstraction. Think of the fortunes in Marxist philosophy of a term as ambiguous as, quote, generalization, end quote, which is used to think, i.e. not to think, the nature of scientific abstraction. The price of this unheard silence is the empiricist temptation. End footnote. The same question can be put in another way. The famous abstract categories of the classical economists, the abstractions that we have to start from in order to produce knowledges, these abstractions were no problem for Marx then. No problem for Marx then. For Marx, these abstractions are the result of a process of preliminary abstraction about which Marx is silent. The abstract categories can then, quote, reflect, end quote, real abstract categories. The real abstract which inhabits the empirical phenomena of the economic world is the abstraction of their individuality. The same question can be put in yet another way. The initial abstract categories, those of the economists, are there at the end. They have indeed produced, quote, concrete, end quote, knowledges, but it does not look as if they have been transformed. It even seems that they did not have to be transformed, that they already existed from the beginning in a form adequate to their object, such that the, quote, thought concrete, end quote, that scientific work is to produce, can emerge as their concretization, pure and simple. their self-complication pure and simple, their self-comparison pure and simple, treated implicitly as their self-concretization. This is how a silence can be extended into an explicit or implicit discourse. The whole theoretical description that Marx gives us remains a formal one, since the whole theoretical description that Marx gives us does not question the nature of these initial abstractions, the problem of these initial abstractions' adequacy to these initial abstractions' object, in short, the object to which these initial abstractions relate, since correlatively it does not question the whole theoretical description that Marx gives us does not question the transformation of these abstract categories during the process of theoretical practice, i.e., the nature of the object implied by these transformations. I'm not attacking Marx for this. Marx did not have to say everything, especially in an unpublished text, and in no case no one can be convicted for not saying everything at once. But Marx's too hurried readers can be attacked for not having heard this silence, and for having rushed into empiricism. Footnote: there must be no misunderstanding of the meaning of this silence. This silence is part of a determinate discourse, whose object was not to set out the principles of Marxist philosophy, the principles of the theory of the history of the production of knowledges, but to establish the methodological rules indispensable to a treatment of political economy. Marx therefore situated himself within an already constituted learning without posing the problem of that learning's production. That is why, within the limits of this text, Marx could treat Smith and Ricardo's, quote, good abstractions, end quote, as corresponding to a certain real, and keep his silence as to the extraordinarily complex conditions that gave birth to classical political economy. Marx could leave in suspense the point of knowing what process could have produced the field of the classical problematic, in which the object of classical political economy could be constituted as an object, giving by its knowledge a certain grasp on the real, even though it was still dominated by ideology. The fact that this methodological text leads us to the threshold of the requirement that we constitute that theory of the production of knowledge, which is the same thing as Marxist philosophy, is a requirement for us, but is also a requirement for which we are indebted to Marx, as long as we are attentive both to the theoretical incompleteness of this text's silence on this particular point, and to the philosophical scope of his new theory of history, in particular to what his new theory of history constrains us to think. The articulation of ideological practice and scientific practice to other practices, and the organic and differential history of these practices. In other words, we can treat the silence in this text in one of two ways, either by taking it for silence that goes without saying, by taking it for a silence that goes without saying, because the silence's content is the dominant theory of empiricist abstraction. Or by treating this silence as a limit and a problem. A limit, the furthest point to which Marx took his thought. But then this limit, far from returning us to the old field of empiricist philosophy, opens a new field before us. A problem. What precisely is the nature of this new field? We now have at our disposal enough studies in the history of learning to suspect that we must look in quite different directions from the empiricist direction. But in this decisive investigation, Marx himself has provided our fundamental principles. The structuration and articulation of the different practices, from which we can see the difference between the ideological treatment of a theoretical silence or emptiness and its scientific treatment. The former confronts us with an ideological closure, the latter with a scientific openness. Here we can see immediately a precise example of the ideological threat that hangs over all scientific labor. Ideology not only lies in wait for science at each point where its rigor slackens, but also at the furthest point where an investigation currently reaches that investigation's limits. There, precisely, philosophical activity can intervene at the level of the life of the science, as a theoretical vigilance that protects the openness of science against the closure of ideology, on condition, of course, that it does not limit itself to speaking of openness and closure in general, but rather of the typical, historically determined structures of this openness and closure. In Materialism and Empiriocriticism, Lenin constantly recalls the absolutely fundamental requirement which constitutes the specific function of Marxist philosophy. End footnote. By locating accurately the site of Marxist silence, we can put the question which contains and coincides with this silence, precisely the question of the differential nature of the abstractions. Which scientific thought works on in order to produce new abstractions at the end of the labor process, which are different from the previous abstractions. And in case of an epistemological break like the one between Marx and the classical economists, radically new. Some time ago, I tried to stress the necessity of thinking this difference by giving different names to the different abstractions that occur in the process of theoretical practice, carefully distinguishing between generalities 1, initial abstractions, and generalities 3, products of the knowledge process. No doubt this was to add something to Marxist discourse, but in a different respect. I was merely re-establishing, i.e. maintaining Marx's discourse without yielding to the temptation of Marx's silence. I heard this silence as the possible weakness of a discourse under the pressure and oppressive action of another discourse, which takes the place of the first discourse in favor of this repression, and speaks in its silence, the empiricist discourse. All I did was to make this silence in the first discourse speak, dissipating the second. The reader may think this a mere detail. Certainly it is, but when rigor is lacking, the more talkative and self-important discourses which deport Marx the philosopher entirely into the very ideology which he fought and rejected, depend precisely on this kind of detail. We shall soon see examples of this, where the non-thought of a minute silence becomes the character for non-thought discourses, i.e., ideological discourses. When I was speaking earlier, I don't know if it said like generalities 1, initial abstractions, and generalities 3, products of the knowledge process. I'm not sure if that generalities 3 was supposed to say generalities 2, but I don't know. But yeah. But that chapter's over, so thank you for listening.